Margaret Johnson, a 68-year-old janitor at Hartwell Industries, pushed her cleaning cart down the long corridor, her movements slow but deliberate. For over 40 years she had walked these halls, quietly maintaining the company's cleanliness, yet to most she was invisible. A ghost who only appeared when a mess needed cleaning. She had never complained, never sought recognition. But today her life was about to change in ways she never expected. A confrontation with a ruthless manager would not only shatter the routine of her day, but also expose the toxic underbelly of corporate culture. What began as humiliation would soon spark a revolution within the company. As Margaret made her way towards the executive wing, her thoughts drifted to her 3 grandchildren. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders, a burden she never expected to bear at this stage in life. 2 years ago, her daughter's sudden passing had left her the sole caretaker of her grandchildren. Every ache in her joints, every twinge in her back, was a painful reminder of why she couldn't retire. She had to keep going. A soft voice broke her thoughts. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson." Margaret looked up to see James Anderson, a young accountant, smiling at her. Unlike most employees, who barely acknowledged her, James always took the time to greet her. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she replied, her voice warm despite her weariness. "How are you today? How are the grandkids?" James asked with genuine interest. A rare smile graced Margaret's face, momentarily lifting the veil of exhaustion. "Growing like weeds, keeping me on my toes." James nodded. "I'm sure they appreciate everything you do for them. You're an inspiration, Mrs. Johnson." Before Margaret could respond, a sharp voice cut through the hallway. "Anderson, don't you have work to do instead of wasting time with the help?" Richard Blackwell, the department manager, strode towards them. His expensive shoes clicked against the floor, his sneer filled with disdain. His cold eyes swept over Margaret before settling on James. James straightened, his friendly demeanor replaced by a professional mask. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. I was just heading to my desk." As James hurried away, Richard turned to Margaret. "And you," he spat, "make sure you actually clean properly today. I'm tired of seeing dust in the corners." Margaret lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I'll do my best." Richard scoffed and walked away, leaving Margaret alone in the hallway. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the familiar sting of his words. This was far from the first time Richard had spoken to her this way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But what neither of them knew was that today would mark the beginning of something greater than either of them could have imagined. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the mop handle. The weight of Richard Blackwell's words settled deep in her chest, pressing down like an invisible force. She had endured years of belittlement, but today felt different. Today something inside her was breaking. As she pushed the mop across the gleaming marble floor of the executive wing, whispers drifted through the hallway. Employees scurried past, heads down, pretending not to notice her. She was used to being invisible, but today the weight of it became unbearable. In the distance, James Anderson sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He had seen Margaret's face when Richard spoke to her, and it left a hollow ache in his chest. He had watched this pattern unfold countless times, yet he had never stepped in to stop it. Fear kept him silent. Fear of Richard, fear of losing his job, fear of rocking the boat. Margaret made her way into the staff lounge, hoping for a moment of quiet. As she filled a cup of water from the dispenser, she overheard 2 employees whispering near the vending machine. "Did you hear? The board is discussing budget cuts again. They're going to let more people go," the other voice murmured. "Rumor has it, they're cutting janitorial staff first." Margaret's grip on her cup tightened, water sloshing over the edges. Was she next? Would her years of dedication be dismissed without a second thought? She swallowed hard, a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Later that afternoon, as she scrubbed the restroom floor, the door swung open sharply. Richard Blackwell's expensive shoes clicked against the tiles as he entered. "Johnson," he barked. "This place is disgusting. Do you even do your job?" Margaret clenched her jaw. "I do my best, sir." "Well, your best isn't good enough," Richard snapped. He took a step closer, his voice lowering to a cruel whisper. "People like you should know when to step aside. You don't belong here anymore." Something inside Margaret snapped. She straightened her back, gripping the mop with white-knuckled hands. For years she had endured his abuse, but today she was done. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice steady. "I've worked here longer than you have. I've kept these halls clean before you ever set foot in this building. I take pride in what I do. And I won't let you talk to me like this anymore." Richard's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before his expression twisted into a sneer. "Oh, is that so? Well, we'll see how long you last here, Johnson." With that, he stormed out, leaving Margaret standing in the empty restroom, her heart pounding in her chest. Unbeknownst to either of them, James Anderson had been standing just outside the door. He had heard every word, and for the first time in his career, he realized he could no longer stay silent. He had to act. As the day ended, Margaret returned home, exhausted but resolute. She sat at the dinner table with her grandchildren, watching them eat, their laughter filling the room. She had spent years trying to shield them from hardship, but she knew she couldn't do it forever. James, meanwhile, sat in his apartment, his mind racing. He drafted an email to the company's HR department, detailing Richard Blackwell's treatment of Margaret and others. His hands trembled as he hovered over the send button. Then, with a deep breath, he clicked it. This was just the beginning. The email James sent had consequences far beyond what he had expected. Within 24 hours, whispers spread through the company. HR had forwarded his report to the board, and an internal investigation into workplace harassment was underway. Employees who had remained silent for years suddenly found the courage to come forward, sharing their own stories of Richard Blackwell's abuses. James found himself in a meeting with senior executives, recounting what he had witnessed. The weight of the truth was undeniable. Margaret, meanwhile, was called in to testify about her experiences. For the first time in decades, she was not invisible. Her voice mattered. As the investigation unfolded, Richard Blackwell's history of discrimination and mistreatment came to light. His unchecked reign of terror had finally reached its breaking point. The board had a decision to make, one that would set a precedent for the company's future. Would they side with power and status, or would they take a stand for justice? The day of reckoning arrived sooner than expected. The board had called for an emergency company-wide meeting to address the internal investigation into workplace harassment. Employees gathered in the large conference hall, whispers of speculation filling the air. The tension was palpable. Margaret Johnson sat in the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Though her heart pounded, she held her head high. She had spent decades serving this company, and today, for the first time, she would watch as justice unfolded in front of her eyes. James Anderson stood near the front, his stomach in knots. He had spent the past week meeting with HR and legal teams, testifying about Richard Blackwell's abuses. Though his fear of retaliation lingered, he knew there was no turning back now. He had made his choice to stand on the side of what was right. When the doors opened, Michael Harrison, the newly appointed CEO, stepped onto the stage. His sharp gaze swept across the room, scanning the anxious faces before him. He took a deep breath before addressing the company. "Good afternoon, everyone. I won't keep you long, but I will be direct." His voice was steady, unwavering. "Over the past few weeks, we have conducted a thorough investigation into the allegations of workplace misconduct. What we have uncovered is unacceptable." A hush fell over the room. Employees exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked relieved, others terrified. Mr. Harrison continued, "This company prides itself on innovation and excellence, but we cannot claim success if we fail in the most fundamental aspect of any business: respect and dignity for our employees. The culture of fear and intimidation that has festered under previous leadership ends today." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Margaret exhaled, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. She had waited for this moment for so long. Harrison turned toward the side of the stage where Richard Blackwell stood, arms crossed, his expression hard and unreadable. "Effective immediately, Mr. Blackwell has been terminated from his position at Hartwell Industries." Gasps filled the room. The long-reigning tyrant had finally fallen. Richard's face paled, his composure faltering for the first time in years. He took a step forward, his mouth opening as if to argue, but Harrison raised a hand to silence him. "There is no room for negotiation," Harrison stated. Your repeated pattern of discrimination, harassment, and abuse of power has no place here. Security will escort you out." 2 uniformed security officers stepped forward, waiting for Richard to comply. His lips curled in fury, but he knew there was no escape. With a final glare at the assembled employees, he turned and stormed out of the room. The sound of the doors shutting behind him felt like the closing of a chapter. A wave of relief swept through the crowd. Some employees exchanged glances of disbelief, while others nodded solemnly. It had finally happened. The reign of Richard Blackwell was over. Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. "This is just the beginning," he declared. "We are implementing a complete overhaul of our company policies. That includes stronger protections against workplace harassment, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and a renewed commitment to diversity and inclusion. Starting today, we build a new culture, one where every employee, regardless of their position, feels valued and respected." A round of applause erupted. James felt a tightness in his chest loosen. This was what he had hoped for: real meaningful change. Mr. Harrison's gaze landed on Margaret. "And Mrs. Johnson," he said, gesturing toward her. "Please stand." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she rose to her feet, every eye in the room now on her. "This company owes you an apology," Harrison continued. "You have dedicated over 40 years of your life to Hartwell Industries, and yet instead of being honored, you were treated with disrespect. That ends today. On behalf of the company, I want to personally apologize for the injustices you have endured." Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. She had never expected this moment. Not in her wildest dreams. "Furthermore," Harrison went on, "we would like to offer you an early retirement package, with full benefits and financial security for your grandchildren. You have earned the right to rest, Mrs. Johnson, and it is time we honor your contributions." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. She opened her mouth to speak but found herself too overwhelmed. The room erupted in applause, employees rising to their feet in a standing ovation. It was a moment of triumph, of long overdue recognition. James watched with a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Margaret had endured so much, and now at last, she was receiving the respect she had always deserved. As the applause died down, Margaret finally found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Thank you all." Mr. Harrison nodded. "Your legacy will not be forgotten, Mrs. Johnson." In the weeks that followed, Hartwell Industries underwent a complete transformation. Employees attended mandatory training sessions on workplace ethics, and an anonymous reporting system was introduced to ensure that no employee ever had to suffer in silence again. James, now the head of the newly established Employee Relations Department, worked closely with HR to ensure the changes were not just policies on paper but a reality within the company culture. Margaret, officially retired, found herself busier than ever. She joined the company's mentorship program, guiding younger employees and ensuring they never faced the struggles she had. She became a symbol of resilience, proof that change was possible. One evening, as James left the office, he found himself reflecting on how much had changed in just a few months. The company felt different, lighter, freer. Employees smiled more, engaged more. The fear that had once clouded the air was gone. He pulled out his phone and dialed Margaret's number. "Mrs. Johnson," he said when she answered. "I just wanted to check in. How are you?" She chuckled. "Retirement suits me well, James, but don't think I'm done keeping an eye on things. I'll be watching to make sure you don't slack off." James laughed, shaking his head. "I wouldn't dare, Margaret." As he hung up, he looked out over the city skyline. Change had come to Hartwell Industries not just because of one person but because of many. Because of Margaret's resilience, James's courage, and the collective voices of those who had refused to remain silent. For the first time in a long time, James felt a deep sense of peace. They had fought for something bigger than themselves, and they had won. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, he stepped forward, ready to continue building a better tomorrow, one step at a time.